So it's 5 p.m. in Riga, it's 2 p.m. UTC. And what time is it where you are, Greg?
It is 10 in the morning.
10 in the morning. So your colleague, Professor Muskin, was with us during the opening ceremony, and it was 8 a.m. where he was in Michigan. So thank you, early birds from the US, for joining us during today's events. And my name is Daniel Fedorovich. I'm the president of the International Economics Olympiad, and this is Ask Greg Mankiw Q&A session. And I don't think that Professor Mankiw needs any introduction. Almost all of our contestants and our teachers, our team leaders, of course, have read his textbooks. And truth to be told, I also read your textbooks, Greg, when I was a high school student. This was about 20 years ago, I think, and it was already translated into Russian. And it was one of the first textbooks in economics that I encountered, and maybe one of the texts which influenced me and made me become an economist. I once met Sylvia Nazar, and I told her that her book, A Beautiful Mind, in a movie which was shot based on this book, also influenced me very much. So now you are the second person, thanks to whom I have become an economist myself. So that's a great honor for me. That's a great honor for the Olympiad to have you. We'll have our Q&A session, and there are more than 100 people attending this Zoom, and we are in the Zoom webinar, so every attendee can actually text their questions to chat or to Q&A pop-up window. I will try to look at both, and I will try to read the questions that I see there, or maybe if the question is interesting and worth discussing at length, and maybe we will promote the authors of these questions to panelists so they can ask Professor Mankiw questions themselves. So we have collected some questions up front, and I should say that they can be divided into 4 topics, 4 categories, and we will go through all of these topics if the time permits, or maybe some of them will be so interesting that we won't make it to the last one. No problem with that. Maybe it's not the last time you're with us, so we'll keep some questions for the future. And these 4 topics actually are the following. First is about, of course, your books. The second is about economics education, studying economics, teaching economics, and so on, because we have many teachers as well here. The 4 other topics are basically the science of economics, the academic profession, and the last is the economy itself. So let me start with the books, of course, because I think all our contestants mostly know you through your books rather than through your academic papers, which they will learn when they are undergraduate students or graduate students. So this morning I visited Amazon, and I found a few books written by Professor Mankiw. They are Principles of Economics, Essentials of Economics, Principles of Microeconomics, Principles of Macroeconomics, Brief Principles of Macroeconomics, Macroeconomics, and Microeconomics, written together with Mark Taylor. So my question is, how much time you spend writing books? Well, what's the share of your time which you spend doing work on your books, rather than doing the academic stuff, writing new papers or talking to some folks in Zoom like right now? So what time does it take?
It does take a fair amount of time. I'm not sure the exact percentage, but I'd say maybe 1/3 of my time is spent working on the books. There's really only, I know if you go to Amazon, it looks like there's lots of books. There's really only 2. But the first book I wrote was an intermediate macroeconomics book from Worth Publishers, and then that's coming out in its 11th edition, actually, in a couple months. And then I wrote a book called Principles of Economics, which is the full year complete introductory book. And then that book, from that book, it spawns a variety of other books. So that book is aimed at a full year course covering both micro and macro. And then the publisher basically takes subsets of chapters and creates one semester versions of the book, depending on what the focus, whether it's micro, macro, or some combination of micro, macro. So all those other books like Principles of Macro, Principles of Micro, Essentials, those are really just subsets of the full book, Principles of Economics. So it's really only 2 books. And I'm actually working right now on the 10th edition of the Principles of Economics book. In fact, I was working on it 15 minutes ago before I got onto the Zoom call. I was working on the update, and each of the 2 books comes out every 3 years. So the world's constantly changing. It's particularly changed a lot in the past 3 years. So there's always new things to talk about. Whether it's new events like the COVID pandemic and recessions, or new policies. You get a new president or new leaders abroad, and you're wondering, okay, what are their policies, and how does that fit standard economics? So there's always new things to talk about. So I've got on the schedule of sort of revising each of the 2 books every 3 years.
In the most academic institutions that I'm aware of, spending 1/3 of your time on undergraduate textbooks is known as suicide. Because, well, I personally also love teaching, and I love writing stuff as popular science, but if you don't publish, you perish, as they say. So did you start doing this textbook stuff after you become tenured professor, or before?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
I wouldn't
okay.
recommend it for somebody untenured. And in fact, when I started this, the year after I got tenure, the chairman of my department asked me to teach the intermediate macroeconomics course, which, like a lot of places, is a required course for majors, and they needed somebody to do it, and I was the natural person. So I kind of knew that I was going to do it for a number of years. In fact, I did do it. I set the assignment and did it for 15 years. And I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to write the lectures for this course and teach it every year, how much more work could it be to put a book together? I thought it wasn't going to be that much extra work. That turned out to be overly optimistic. It actually is a fair amount of extra work. But I also found in the process of doing it that I enjoyed it. But you're right, there's a big opportunity cost of time in terms of doing that. So I sort of deal with that several ways. One is my wife will tell you I have basically no hobbies. I basically spend all my time doing economics of some sort. So I kind of work seven days a week. Mainly because I enjoy it. I love economics. I love what I'm doing. So it doesn't ever feel like work. But I do. If somebody will sort of follow me during the day, they'd realize that I spend a fair amount of my time, probably certainly more than 40 hours a week, doing economics of some sort. Part is I also bought off some teaching. So in the course of writing these books, I've actually taken reduced teaching loads at some point, taken reduced salary from the university. So actually right now I'm only teaching half-time at Harvard. So I only teach 1 course a year at Harvard. So it gives me more time to write and do other things. But you're right. I mean, life is full of trade-offs. And as an economist, there's all sorts of exciting stuff to do.
One of the 10 principles, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's the first principle. Is life. That's right. So, I've also taken off time from my academic career to do some policy work in Washington. That also has an opportunity cost. That's actually far more demanding than textbook writing, I'll tell you, being an economic policy advisor. That really is intense work. So one thing I love about economics is that there's so many different things you can do. There's research, there's graduate teaching, undergraduate teaching, op-eds, policy work, textbook work. There's all sorts of different ways of being an economist. And that's one thing that's very exciting about it as a field. And I've tried to do a little bit of everything over the course of my career.
Did you ever have an idea of writing a popular science book rather than a textbook?
I've been asked about that a lot. And it's
okay. I'm sorry.
No. I've been asked by publishers, and publishers sort of approach me, say, "Oh, would you like to write one of those books?" And I'm always tempted, but I'm also cognizant of sort of the opportunity cost. And since both of my textbooks are selling well, and those 2 publishers are constantly asking for revisions, I feel like I don't really have enough time in my schedule to do that. So I do write regular columns for the New York Times, which I reach a broad audience that way. But those are much shorter. Those are like 900 words as opposed to writing a 100,000 word book. So it's much easier to write an occasional column for a popular newspaper than it is to try to write an entire book for the general public.
Do you have any favorite popular science books in economics by other authors? What would you recommend to
funny.
our...
I teach a freshman seminar, which is separate from the Introductory Economics book course at Harvard. So there's a separate course at Harvard called Ec 10, which is the basic introductory economics course, but then I teach a freshman seminar that a small number of students take concurrently. It's capped at 12 students. And there we read books by economists written for the general public, talking about public policy issues. So it's not technical. There's no graphs and stuff like in math. It's just sort of public policy discussion. We talk about, and I run the course as like a book club. We get together once a week and talk about the books. So I have a whole set of books that we use. So I always start with The Worldly Philosophers, which is Robert Heilbronner's great book about the history of economic thought, and that's wonderful. The students always love Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. Milton Friedman is such a great writer.
Never gets old. Never gets old. Milton Friedman.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't. I mean, the book was written in the early 1960s.
Yeah, right.
But it's still timeless, because the idea, he's really writing for the ages. He's not writing for that particular moment. Even the students who completely disagree with Friedman appreciate Friedman's clarity in the arguments. And then there's newer books. There's a wonderful book called The Wisdom of Finance by Mihir Desai over at Harvard Business School, which is a wonderful book talking about how the ideas of finance can help inform people's everyday life. And I'm always sort of also looking for sort of newer books. I'm in the middle of 2 books right now that I'm thinking of adding next year that just came out in the past year. One is by Deirdre McCloskey and Art Carden, called Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, which is a 200-page summary of McCloskey's 3-volume, 1,700-page bourgeois trilogy about his take on economic history. And that's really very interesting. And then Bill Nordhaus has a new book called The Spirit of Green, which is about how to think about climate change and contagion and other things, all these big externalities that affect societies in light of basic economics. So it's also very good. Those are 2 books I think I'm going to add this coming year, just for fun.
Is there a list of books available of this reading seminar that you mentioned?
Yeah, I've sometimes posted it on my blog, but actually the best place to look is if you take a copy of my textbook and you look at here, I'm going to pick up a copy here. If you look at the back end papers of my textbook, so this called Suggestions for Summer Reading, and most of the books that I use in this freshman seminar are there, and that's what that Suggestions for Summer Reading are. They're kind of fun books about economics that you might sort of pick up and take to the beach with you during your next vacation.
All right, now to the economics education. You're a famous educator, but so your opinion is very valuable for us all. But there was a famous story, I don't remember, was it 2 years ago, when you stepped down from teaching this principles course in Harvard, and there was some media coverage of this, which said that what Mankiw teaches it should be replaced with something else. Well, I personally know people who think so. What do you think of this? Do you think that the teaching of economics, the way we teach principles, for example, I myself, an undergraduate instructor, do you think the way we teach principles based on your books, for example, should somehow fundamentally change? So the hint, I'm hinting at the following, that maybe we should far less models, or no models, no math at all. Maybe we should discuss more real life, something like that. So your textbooks, they have both, but they are thick. Yep. So as a teacher, during the lectures, I have to choose whether I go deeper into math or I go into examples. That's very fun, everyone loves it, but then they go out of the room and think, okay, what I have just learned, was it just an anecdote or what? What do you think of this? Because there is some movement from students who think that the education should be changed. What's your take?
Yeah, no, you're right that I stepped down from teaching the introductory course at Harvard. The reason was much more mundane than some of the articles suggested. I taught that course for 14 years, and I just said, okay, it was time to do something else. I just wanted to after doing anything for 14 years, it's sort of fun to do something else. I also was going to reduce my amount of teaching at Harvard. As I mentioned earlier, I'm only teaching half-time now. So I teach that freshman seminar, but I passed the baton to teaching the introductory course just for a change of pace. I think the basic core material that we teach in introductory economics, things like supply and demand, comparative advantage, the link between the money supply and inflation, the role of aggregate demand and on the business cycle, those ideas are still very important and still need to be taught. And they still are being taught at Harvard just by other people. So I don't think that course has changed fundamentally in the past few years. I think the course does evolve, and that's one of the reasons why I revise my books every 3 years, is because they evolve in part because events change and we got to make contact with the recent events, and in part because what economists consider important changes over time. So actually, in this current revision of my principles book, that's not going to be out, that I'm working on now, but won't be out for about a year and a half or so. I'm adding sort of 2 chapters in that. One is a chapter on the economics of healthcare, because health economics has become increasingly important as a part of public policy as health spending as a share of the economy grows over time. And I'm also adding a chapter on what's called how economists use data, which is basically a very basic introduction to econometrics, which is not usually taught at the freshman level. But I've written, a 25-page chapter that's basically introducing the basic tools of econometrics at the freshman level. It was previously available, by the way, as an optional chapter in the electronic version of the book. So if you're using the online version, the professor can add that now, that chapter, as well as the healthcare chapter. But I've come to realize that those 2 topics, healthcare and basic data, are especially important. They should be put in the book proper, and so they'll be in the book in the next edition. The key, of course, is always to figure out if we're going to add more stuff, whether it's the fun stuff like applications or more topics like healthcare, econometrics. What do we take out? Because while economics expands as a field, students' capacity to absorb information isn't. I mean, the human brain is a constraint on all of us. And so as we teach, we got to sort of figure out, okay, how are we going to optimize subject to the constraint of what students can learn in the course of a semester or a year. And so that's always the sort of the constant trade-off, is trying to figure out what not to put in. You mentioned that my book is long, and you're right, it's 800 pages, but it's actually shorter than a lot of my competition.
Right.
It's not unusual to have people write a 1,000-page book, or you see some books that have double column format, so they can put more words per page. So so actually, an 800-page book is actually a short book for this course. But I'm sure no student picks it up and say, oh, well, it's only 800 pages, great, easy to read. So so I think we have to be very careful at figuring out what are we going to include and just as important, maybe more important, what we're not going to include. One of my predecessors in teaching introductory economics at Harvard was a guy named Otto Eckstein, who sadly died in the mid-'80s. But he used to say to the teaching assistants, he used to say that the less you teach them, the more they learn. Meaning, don't overwhelm them, because if you overwhelm them, it'll just become a mash of ideas floating around. If you focus on a small number of core topics, they'll really get those, and they'll actually end up being richer for it. I think that's a very important lesson for all of us who teach introductory economics.
Are you familiar with the CORE project, CORE?
Yes, I am. I looked at a little bit of it.
Yeah, so because they say that they are the opposition to what is usually done.
I don't view myself. I mean, I guess I have competitors. All markets have competitors, and like all producers, I'm not fond of having competitors. But as an economist, I recognize that competition makes the world better, and I think my books are better by virtue of having to compete CORE and a variety of other books that are out there.
Okay, so one of the questions which pops up from time to time from high school students is about choosing major and entering college or university. So, and in the last few years, I've noticed that this question is most often asked in the following way: should I aspire to become an economist? Is it just still worth it? Maybe today, in the year 2021, everyone should become a computer scientist or mathematician or whatever. An economics major seems like too easy, too untechnical, things like this. What would you recommend if a person wants to become an economist 10 years from today? What should this person do today, either computer science or the theoretical math, or Gregory Mankew's textbooks, Principles of Economics?
Well, I think at the undergraduate level, the best thing to do is to learn broadly and not to sort of focus very narrowly on one area, because there are synergies across different areas, and that early in your career as a student, you're in the best position to recognize and take advantage of those synergies across fields. So for sure, if you're interested in becoming economists for sure take the economics courses, but also take courses that are going to provide you tools that are going to be useful in economics. So take math courses, take the computer science courses, take history courses, take psychology courses. So I think all of those areas contribute to a richer thinking about economic issues. So I really do think at the undergraduate level, learning very broadly is very important. And I also think majoring in economics is a useful pathway, not just for becoming an economist, but for a whole variety of different fields. So if you're interested in becoming a lawyer, for example, it's understanding economics is great for studying law. So even if you're going to go into law, taking some economics courses so you understand the foundation for, say, tax policy or antitrust law or a variety of other areas of law. You know, my daughter was an economics major and she's now in medical school. And if you think of it, at first that seems very strange, but if you think about a lot of health policy issues, health policy issues involve both a substantial amount of economics and a substantial amount of health, of understanding health, medicine. So I think economics is a great stepping stone for lots of different careers. And then even if you do decide to become a professional economist, there's lots of things a professional economist can do. Some go into academia like I did, some go into work for governments, some go for work in the private sector like in banks. And so I think there's lots of ways you can become a professional economist and practice your skills.
What do you think of teaching economics at the high school level? Because we are here at the Olympiad for high school students. So
I think the more people learn basic economics, what I teach in my textbook or core, or there's lots of books out there. I'm only one of many. I think what we teach at that level really should be a foundational knowledge for every voter. So I think, and if people are going to vote intelligently on public policy and understand the set of trade-offs that policymakers face, they really need to know a little bit of economics. So I think it'd be great if what we think of as introductory economics increasingly migrated into the high school curriculum rather than the college curriculum. I didn't have any economics, by the way, when I was in high school. I literally had taken 0 economics courses. And let me tell you a little bit how I got into economics. When I came to college, I didn't really even think about economics as a major. I wasn't sure what I was going to major in, and I kind of tried out a bunch of things. I tried math, tried philosophy. My first declared major was actually a math major. But during my freshman year, I started dating a young woman who was taking an economics course. And she would, on our dates, she was very excited about the course, taught by a wonderful teacher, a guy named Harvey Rosen at Princeton. And she told me about what she was learning. And I thought it was really interesting what she was learning. It seemed more interesting than anything I was learning in any of my courses. So the next semester, my second semester freshman year, I started taking economics again from Harvey Rosen. I took it from the same professor he did. And it was great. And that was really sort of what launched my career in economics, taking that course from Harvey. Harvey and I have become friends, and I worked for him as a research assistant as an undergraduate. Decades later, he and I worked at the Council of Economic Advisors together. We were colleagues. So, but it was really just sort of the happenstance of having to be dating a young woman who was taking economics that let me stumble into this field. I don't know if I would have discovered it otherwise. You never know. There's a lot of serendipity in life, but that was really a lucky coincidence for me.
So you just date the right people, and then you end up in good places.
Well, that's good advice always, actually.
Yeah, that's a universal advice. So I don't know whether you're familiar with the book Better Living Through Economics by John Siegfried, where he mentions every chapter is some achievement of the economics profession, which he thinks actually did the world better, made the world a better place. So if you were to name one or at most two aspects in which economics profession, the academic economics, actually made the world we live in a better place, what would you say?
If I'd probably go back to Adam Smith and talk. And Adam Smith basically made markets and entrepreneurship and trying to make money a respectable activity. I'm actually in the middle. One of the books as I mentioned earlier, one of the books I'm reading now is the one by Deirdre McCloskey and Art Carden called "Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich." And their basic big theme, which I think is really very interesting, is that the reason we're so much wealthier than we were 2 centuries ago was these people came to understand that what they call bourgeois values, the idea that people are going to open a business, try to make money, provide a good for customers to support their family, that's basically a reputable, admirable activity. And that was really the an idea that goes back to Adam Smith and that part and that part of history. It certainly was also very much wrapped up with the American Revolution. The idea that people left alone to basically pursue their own lives is a fine thing. Previously, the good life was serving your king, or previously a good life was, being a pious person as defined by your church. And was the idea of sort of opening up a shop just to make money seemed slightly ignoble. And I think what Smith basically says that's not such a bad thing to do at all. That you're serving your customers, you're making money for your family. That the sort of what we think is the bourgeois lifestyle actually pushes progress along, and it's pushed progress along fantastically for 2 centuries. And that's sort of McCloskey's big idea in his bourgeois trilogy. And so I really, if I had to say one big idea that economists has contributed, I think it really goes back to Adam Smith. And indeed, a lot of what we teach in introductory economics really is in Smith. I think we do it with a higher degree of precision. Like I view my textbook as very Marshallian in the sense of having a very heavy use of supply and demand curves, which Smith didn't have. But I think what the use of supply and demand curves, what it really does is it explains the ideas that Smith put forward with a greater degree of precision. And it also explains why sometimes markets don't work. Things like, if you go back to like externalities in the role of Pigovian corrective taxes. So I think that supply and demand curves are extremely sort of useful tools, and that's sort of well after Smith. But I think the idea is that the competitive markets kind of work out pretty well for everyone under normal circumstances. That's just a huge idea that's not at all obvious before you studied economics.
There was a very good question in our Q&A section, but unfortunately it's from the anonymous attendee, so I cannot promote him or her to ask the question themselves. So I will read it. What's the best source of economics news or news about the economy?
That's a good question. I read, well, every morning I read both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. So those are my two. I mean, I think if you're interested in more international news, they're very US focused. They have international news as well, but it's more US focused than maybe a lot of your listeners. So something like the Financial Times is also very good. I don't read them as regularly, but I do occasionally. Those are probably the 3 dailies that I think are most reliable. And then if you're looking for a weekly, I mean, maybe reading 3 newspapers a day is too much for most people. But I think that The Economist magazine is great. It's funny, I used to subscribe to that. I don't now, but I do occasionally pick it up. And I think it's the best weekly out there in terms of smart coverage of economics.
Okay, now I will turn to our talk about the economy itself, because I think we exhausted the questions about your personal business and the profession. So there are a few questions about the economy and the matters which interest our contestants and other participants. For example, there is a question in chat, and similar questions appeared in our application form when we collected questions up front. Probably this will be in your book, but before it came out, maybe you will say a few words. The COVID-19, what is the main thing which it taught us in terms of economic theory? Maybe something should be thrown into garbage bin. Some theories, or maybe something new which is already in the debate should now become new theory. The new textbook models might appear. So, will there be any shift in the economics science after this pandemic? What do you think?
Okay, well, I mean, I don't think it's going to be probably a huge impact on economic science, although I think it certainly puts to bed the hypothesis that Robert Lucas once said. Robert Lucas once said that all recessions are alike, which I can't tell if he was being provocative or he actually meant it, but I think what's pretty clear is that this recession is very, very different from recessions that have come before, and it's different mainly because, unlike most recessions, this recession was a recession by design. And by that, I mean, most recessions happen because of some accident, like financial crisis happens and some financial institutions find themselves underwater. And we realized this was a terrible mistake. And we tried it if people are unemployed, and we're trying to get people back to work as quickly as possible. It takes a long time to happen because our tools aren't all that powerful. This recession was a recession by design in the sense that once we realized there was a pandemic, we told people, stay at home. Don't go to work if you work in a restaurant. If you're a customer, don't go eat in a restaurant. We just want to shut down certain parts of the economy. And so we're telling both the customers and the workers to stay at home unless they're sort of essential services. And so therefore the decline in GDP and the decline in employment was particularly large, particularly sharp, but exactly what we wanted to happen at that moment. We wanted that big decline in employment and GDP because we didn't want the spread. So the whole shutdowns were intentional, which is very different from most recessions. And as a result, because the shutdowns were intentional, we had the tools to get back very quickly. So the recovery is a very short recession, and the recovery was, well, it's not complete yet. I mean, we've recovered a lot from the trough of this recession, and it was been very quick. So this has been a very short and fast recession and a very quick recovery. And so this is really just showed this is a different kind of recession. Now, I think when we do a postmortem of this, we're going to look back and say, okay, well, did we use the tools we have in the best possible way? And I think there's a widespread agreement that this is such an unusual situation that we needed a degree of social safety net that probably wasn't available in most recessions and wasn't sort of in place. And so the U.S. Congress, I'm sure many other legislatures around the world, passed policies to provide a buffer against the economic downturn and help people through in ways that they might not have done in a typical recession. I think we will look back and we will realize that some of the tools we used were useful, some of them weren't useful. A lot of money went to people who didn't really need it, and so on. So I think we'll recognize that it was that what we did when we did things fast, we did things imperfectly, and that's not. I would not blame the legislature for that, because whenever you do something new and fast, you're probably going to make some mistakes along the way. So I don't blame the legislatures for that, but I think we'll learn a lot in the postmortems about how we might do it better, better next time. When Harvard closed down at the beginning of the pandemic, they abandoned all grading, so there's no longer A, B, C, D, fail. It's now they went to emergency pass, emergency fail, which means they weren't going to try to distinguish between an A and a B. And I think sort of the legislatures, the policymakers who are responding have to be sort of graded in the same way. So I think policymakers basically, I wouldn't sort of grade them on an A to B, C scale. I'd grade them on an emergency pass, emergency fail. And I think they passed. I think overall the policy responses have been good. But I think but with the benefit of hindsight, we can, I think, fine tune that judgment a little bit, and so we can do better next time.
To the same topic, because a few months ago you wrote in New York Times that this column about speed limits, that maybe the huge support measures of the economy which Biden administration introduced were just overreaction, because the speed limit is unknown and you don't know whether you exceed it. I like the metaphor very much, but after a few months pass, I want to ask whether you think it's the case that they overreacted.
Yeah, I do. I think the United States had a much bigger fiscal response, including, if you include the last Biden bill that was passed already, the U.S. fiscal response was much bigger than was true in most other countries. I mean, if before the first Biden rescue plan that was passed back in, I think, February, the U.S. and the European responses were kind of similar in size. We were among the bigger ones, but sort of similar to a lot of the European fiscal responses. When you add the Biden one on top of that, it's the biggest in the world. And if you look at the things that they're now proposing in front of Congress, which is not about COVID, it's just about general increases in spending for infrastructure and other things, the spending the fiscal stimulus is really very large in the United States. Now, there's a question about whether we've overdone it, and the question is whether we go past the speed limit. That is, we're going to go past sort of the natural level of output, or unemployment below the natural rate of unemployment. And the truth is, it's very hard to know. You know, in my intermediate macro book, I have a box that's all about, it sounds like a boring topic, but it's about standard errors around the natural rate of unemployment. And it basically points out that there's econometricians run models trying to estimate what the natural rate of unemployment is. And those estimates come with very large standard errors. And that is, so as a result, the confidence intervals, of which you're sure the natural rates in this range are very large. So at any given moment, if you're asking yourself, oh, have we pushed the economy, past its speed limit, past the natural level of output, it's very hard to know. And I think we're in a situation now where we might have enough fiscal stimulus in place that by the end of this year, we'll be beyond the natural level of output, and we'll have some serious inflationary pressures. And you see this already in the United States. I mean, inflation has come up. The Fed has said it's all temporary factors, and to some extent that's surely true. But if you look at sort of tightness in certain markets, and in particular the labor market, it seems very, very tight. So if you look at things like job openings, there's a lot of job openings right now. If you look at the number of quits, workers quitting their job, it's actually also quite high. And workers don't quit their jobs unless they think they can get a new job. So that provides their perception of how tight the labor market is, that the jobs are available. So the fact that quits are high, the number of job openings is high, all suggests that the labor market is much tighter than you might think. The people who think there's a lot of slack in the economy are looking at the level of employment, and they're saying, the level of employment now is still well below what it was at its peak just before the pandemic hit in January 2019. And that's true, employment is still down. The question is, to what extent has this pandemic induced some people to leave the labor market, perhaps permanently? It's induced some people to retire early. It's changed certain people's view of the world, saying maybe I don't really need to work all the time. The fact that they've gotten all this pandemic relief in the form of unemployment insurance and other sort of social safety net checks means they're sort of flush with cash. Maybe they think, I don't need to go back to work quite as soon because I have all this cash sitting in the bank. I mean, people have been sending me the checks, but I can't spend it because I can't go to restaurants. And if you look at sort of liquid assets like M2, the amount of liquid assets sitting in people's bank accounts is just huge. And we think that's inflationary, but I also kind of wonder to what extent it might have something to do with labor supply. People might say, look at all this cash in their bank account and say, maybe I don't need to go back to work quite so soon until I've worked through some of this cash. So sort of it's like an income effect on labor supply. So I think it's very unclear now how much we're below. So we're probably still below the natural rate, but not very much. And I think we'll exceed it at some point by the end of this year, early next year. And then the question is, at that point, will inflation really start becoming problematic?
Well, one more thing about labor market. What do you think of the universal basic income? Maybe that's the most popular, after the Bitcoin, of course. That's the second most popular question to Professor Mankiw. What do you think of UBI? Is it our future, which is waiting for us when everything is automated, or what?
Well, I'm not concerned that the world's going to go, the world's going to go so automation and most workers will become irrelevant, and therefore there's nothing for people to do. So that does not concern me, because I think fear of machines and that the humans become irrelevant, I think has always been a fear of technology, going back to the Luddites, right, hundreds of years ago. So that doesn't bother me particularly as a concern. On the other hand, I think the idea of a UBI does make some sense as a social safety net. And this idea really goes back many, many decades. I first read about it in Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. He called it a negative income tax. The term UBI didn't exist then, but if you look at what Friedman was saying, it's basically a UBI. He's basically arguing for a form of a UBI. And I think that kind of makes sense as a social safety net. There's a debate about to what extent that would discourage some people from working. There's a wonderful book, actually, I used in my freshman seminar, called Give People Money by Annie Lowry, who's an economics journalist. And she goes through a lot of the arguments. And she argues basically that, yes, it would have some disincentive effects, but not much. The income effects of getting $1,000 a month, say. I think that's still open to debate. There's a wonderful paper by Michael Golosoff and several other authors. I just posted on my blog.
The lotteries, yeah.
Yeah, the effects of it looks at the effects of lottery winners and how they actually use the effects of. It looks like they were the best studies of. There's been other studies of lottery winners before this, by the way. So I think it's a fascinating area. This seems to be one of the best in the sense of having really good data on this and analyzing it fairly carefully and thoroughly. And they then try to calibrate how much of would a UBI induce people to reduce their labor supply, and they found fairly sizable effects actually. So that might provide an argument in favor of an anti-UBI argument for some people. I still think it still sort of makes sense as a simpler way of providing a social safety net than the sort of complex quilt of a variety of different policies we have, this patchwork of different policies. I should know, by the way, that the Biden administration, one of their signature initiatives is this child tax credit, which, if you look at it, is really just a UBI for people with children. Mm. So we have, that's not how they frame it, by the way. But if you sort of take a step back, what are they really doing here? They're saying, well, people with children, we're going to give them unconditional money, just give it to them as a tax credit. That's kind of like a mini UBI for families with children. So I think there's a sense in which we're kind of moving in that direction. The earned income tax credit also has somewhat UBI features. So I think policy is moving in a UBI direction. We may never go 100% there. So UBI may be more like a thing that intellectuals talk about as sort of an ideal form, but policy is sort of fine. But often policy doesn't move in one big leap to some new idea. They sort of move piecemeal towards something, and we seem to be moving piecemeal in that direction.
Do you think that this pandemic and the consequences of it and the government's response will make the world a more equal or less equal place in terms of within countries and in terms of between countries?
Yeah, I mean, the most important fact about inequality to know is that inequality within countries like the United States in particular has been rising a lot. But if you take the global perspective, inequality has been falling because we've seen.
Yeah. That's why I'm asking two questions.
But make sure that all the listeners know that. I think it's a really important fact. They know we live in a much more equal world because we've seen rapid growth in the very poor countries, in particular China and India. They're two very large countries. Lots of poor people have grown very rapidly in recent decades. So if you take a global perspective, which I try to do, then inequality is actually getting better, not worse. That doesn't provide a lot of solace to people who are only focused on inequality within their own country, say within the United States. Putting it, oh, by the way, I know inequality is rising here, but China's doing great. That doesn't provide. No American politician would ever sort of say that. Although as a tenured academic, I can say that. So what's COVID going to do to it? I don't think we really know yet. So far, the evidence has been that I think COVID has increased inequality in part because people like me, higher income people, tend to have jobs that they can do more remotely. Here we are talking virtually, right? And I taught my class virtually. So, and most of my relationship with my publisher has always been virtual, actually. So my job can be done, pretty much 100% via the computer. That's not true for lots of lower income jobs. If you're a meat packer, if you're a person working in a grocery store, there's lots of sort of lower income jobs that sort of service jobs that kind of have to be done in person. And so I think inequality did go up during this. What it's going to do longer term, I think, is harder to say. I'm actually kind of optimistic that the scientists have really delivered the goods in the vaccine. And once we convince enough people to take the vaccine, we can go back to sort of a normal life. So I actually suspect there won't be huge impacts on the economy, permanent impacts on the economy. I think we've learned a lot. We've learned about what things can be done virtually. If you'd asked me to fly to Latvia, I would have been hard pressed to fly to Latvia to give this talk. But I'm very happy doing it, virtually. And maybe even once we're all fairly past pandemic, maybe we'll have more virtual things like this because we've learned they work well. And I've never done anything on Zoom before the pandemic, and now I feel like I'm an expert on Zoom. So I think we've learned things, and that'll stay with us permanently. But I'm hopeful that in general, the long-term impact in the economy is not going to be large.
So 2 years ago, actually, I asked you to fly to Kazakhstan, and you were reluctant to do this, but thankfully the pandemic made it all possible. So Last year you greeted the contestants, and this year we are talking. So you mentioned externalities and Pigovian taxes, and one of the questions which I like very much from our students is the following. So this is about vaccination. We understand that if a person is vaccinated, then this decision to be vaccinated creates a positive externality. So perhaps he's less infectious, so fewer people will contract coronavirus. On the other hand, if a person is not vaccinated, this is also a decision not to be vaccinated, and this sort of creates negative externality. Even if this person is healthy, even if this person has this symptomless disease, he or she might infect someone. So Pigou tells us that we should incentivize vaccination, or we should punish non-vaccinations. We should tax non-vaccination if we just read straight the advice about positive and negative externalities. So, and different countries actually do different of these two, or a combination of those. What do you think? What measures in terms of stimulating vaccination might be the most efficient?
Oh yeah, I agree completely. I mean, one of the interesting things about health economics in general is that externalities are all over the place. And that's especially true when you think about vaccines, because a person's decision to have a vaccine obviously is a personal decision, and it has deep implications for yourself. And I got vaccinated as soon as I possibly could, as did all my family. But it also affects other people as well. And to be honest, I was when I got vaccinated, I was doing it for purely selfish motives. So I didn't want to get sick. But even if I didn't have that motive, presumably you have to think about the impacts on other people. I wrote a column for the New York Times even before. This is I think back in February, or maybe it was January. So sometime 6, 7, 8 months ago, just before the vaccines had been approved, but they were clearly coming out. It seemed very likely they were going to be approved. At that point, Biden was proposing his rescue plan that was giving people about $1,000 each. And I said we should make that $1,000 contingent on getting vaccinated. We should basically subsidize vaccinations at $1,000 a person. Now, this idea was not new to me. I actually first read about the idea from a Brookings Institution economist named Robert Lighton, who proposed an interesting column. But I wrote the column for the Times just to give Bob Lighton's idea some publicity, because I thought it was a great idea. And it's really just straight economics. If something has a positive externality, subsidize it. Something has negative externality, tax it. We might think about doing that in other ways. We might say, okay, well, if you're not vaccinated, you're more likely to get sick, and so therefore we're going to charge you higher health premiums. So you could do it also with a stick rather than with a carrot. I think the carrot might be a little more politically palatable. Interestingly, there was some other group of economists, behavioral economists, who after my column wrote a column rebutting me, arguing against the $1,000 subsidy for people getting vaccinated. And their argument was a sort of psychological argument. They were saying, look, if you pay people to get vaccinated, that'll make people think there's something wrong with the vaccine, because you have to pay them to do it. Well, it must be something wrong with it. And they're afraid because it might make people more vaccine hesitant. I thought it was an interesting argument. At the end of the day, I'm maybe more neoclassical than that. I actually think $1,000 per payment would have gotten a lot of people on board, especially a lot of people who are saying, I'm not sure. For $1,000, they might have gone along. So I actually think the $1,000 per shot would have been a good policy. But anyway, it didn't happen. The United States, we tried other things. They entered people in a lottery. So you get a lottery ticket. So you get a small chance of winning $1 million if you get vaccinated. I just think if we're already sending out checks for $1,000 per person, which Biden was getting ready to do at that point, why not combine it with the vaccine policy? But they didn't pick up on the Lighton idea.
Yeah, sounds very logical. Well, in Russia, where I am, government has apparently chosen the strategy of punishing people who is not vaccinated. So it's prohibiting activities and stuff like this, prohibiting from going to work, even if you have to be at your workplace. So things like this. Yeah, well, so we are running out of time. Maybe the last question, and I have to ask it, given the popularity. So what do you think about the future of cryptocurrencies? And do you personally invest in cryptocurrencies? And do you think that do you think that someone should invest in cryptocurrencies? Things like that. I think there are a few dozens of questions
like
which
that.
was about this.
You know, I don't fully understand. I mean, I read a lot about this. I understand blockchain a little bit. I don't 100% understand the technology. So, and I basically avoid buying things I don't understand. So I don't have any of my money personal. I basically my personal investments, by the way, are pretty simple. I believe what I teach in the textbook, which is the value of diversification. So basically, all my money is basically in index funds, and it's very widely diversified, but both across many companies and across many countries. So I have much international as well. So I'm a big believer in diversification. I'm skeptical of cryptocurrencies. I can understand why somebody would put a little bit in. I wouldn't put a lot in, given it's a very small percentage of the world market portfolio. And I think the world market portfolio is sort of the place you start in thinking about investments. I don't fully understand why zero is not a good equilibrium price for Bitcoin. If I don't understand why zero is not a good equilibrium price, I don't understand why anything. So it seems like it could go anywhere. People who are more into this technology than I am have said to me, they don't quite believe in cryptocurrencies, but they think blockchain may have the technology behind blockchain, behind cryptocurrencies, may be useful in other contexts. So companies that are exploring the uses of blockchain, they have more of a future than cryptocurrencies in and of itself. And that's an interesting hypothesis, which strikes me as at least plausible. So I'm not, as I said, I don't put anything in cryptocurrencies. I don't plan to anytime soon. And the one advice I give anybody who's planning to do it is don't put a large percentage of your market of your portfolio in that. But the market, it's a small percentage of market portfolios. I'm guessing at most 1 or 2%. Don't put more than 1 or 2% of your net worth in that, and just go hold the broad, world stock market, and you'll do fine in the long run.
Can you imagine a world without central banks when everything is on blockchain, everything is decentralized? This is sort of utopian idea, which is behind the whole thing.
Well, there is. Right, exactly. There is a sort of utopian idea, so this libertarian ideal. I don't. The problem with cryptocurrencies is not really currencies, in the sense that people don't really use them for transactions. It's pretty rare these days. You go to your local Starbucks or your coffee shop, whatever is in your country. You go to your local coffee shop and you say, "Oh, I'd like to have a coffee. How many Bitcoin is that?" No, they're not. It's very unlikely they're going to take it. Right? It's just not a medium of exchange at this point. It's so volatile in prices relative to other prices that it's not really a very good unit of account. So the only thing really is at this point is a store of value. And it's a store of value without any dividend. Now, there's other things without dividends. Gold doesn't have any dividends, but there's a limited amount of gold. Whereas there's no, and it's limited amount of Bitcoin, but there's no limited number of cryptocurrencies. And so I'm not completely understand why sort of other, Bitcoin 2, Bitcoin 3, whatever you want to call them, are going to constantly sort of grow. So I think we're in an era of very, very low real interest rates. I think it's an era of very low interest rates is an environment where speculative bubbles are more likely to form. And I kind of worry that's what's going on with a lot of these cryptocurrencies. And if interest rates go up to more historically normal levels, then people start saying, the fact that there's no yield on this Bitcoin makes it not very attractive to hold long term. And so its value as a store of value may look less attractive at that point. Yeah.
So the advice from Greg Mankiw is diversify anyway, if you have some money to invest, because this is what people are asking. That's what they are going to do in one of the parts of our competition. So they will try to invest some fake artificial money and see what happens. So I think we should finish here. Almost an hour has passed, and I really, really thank you, Greg, for joining us. And unfortunately, most of the questions remained unasked. So maybe next time, hopefully, this Zoom environment can help us meet more often than once in a life. So, but in almost all questions, our students and our teachers, they thank you for your textbooks. They thank you for being so open. And I thank you again for joining us. This was Greg Mankiw in Q&A session for the International Economics Olympiad.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.